We think of the market as a place of noise, shouting on trading floors, flashing headlines, endless commentary. But that's just the theater. The real game, the one played by the titans of finance, happens in the silence. It's a game of observation, of recognizing a deep structural flaw in the world that everyone else has accepted as normal. It's about seeing a single crack in a dam that has stood for a generation. In late 2012, while the world was looking elsewhere, two men were staring at that crack. One was George Soros, the philosopher king of hedge funds, a man so powerful his bets could challenge governments. The other, his former protege, Stanley Druckenmiller, a trading prodigy with a reputation for betting with near-psychic conviction. Independently, they were watching the world's third-largest economy, Japan, and they saw something that everyone else was missing. They saw that an entire nation was on the verge of a state-sanctioned financial revolution, and they realized they could get in on the ground floor. This isn't just a story about a great trade. This is the story of how two minds, operating on a different plane, orchestrated a billion-dollar checkmate against the consensus of the entire world.
Get free access to our online trading course in the description and in the pinned comments. If you want to learn more about ETFs, more about the foreign exchange market, and more about basic financial literacy, then this is a must for you. Be sure to download it.
To understand the sheer genius of this trade, you have to understand the gilded cage Japan had built for itself. After the insanity of the 80s bubble, the Japanese economy didn't just slow down. It entered a state of suspended animation. For 20 years, it was haunted by the ghost of deflation. Think of it as economic quicksand. The longer you're in it, the harder it is to escape. Prices fall, so people wait to buy. Because people wait, companies can't make money, so they lower wages. With lower wages, people have even less to spend. It's a cycle of decay. But here's the paradox. While its economy was dying, its currency, the yen, became a global superstar. Why? Because in a world of chaos, Japan was stable. It wasn't growing, but it wasn't going to implode either. So, when the 2008 financial crisis set the world on fire, global capital needed a bomb shelter. And they chose the yen. This flood of money made the yen incredibly strong. For a nation of exporters like Japan, this was like trying to run a marathon with a ball and chain. Every Toyota, every PlayStation sold abroad brought back fewer yen. It was strangling their biggest companies. The government was powerless. They had a zombie economy and a superhero currency. They threw money at the problem, building bridges to nowhere, but it was like trying to fill the ocean with a bucket. The world had decided, Japan was stagnant, and the yen was strong. This was the unbreakable reality. And whenever the market believes something is unbreakable, it creates the single greatest opportunity for a trader, the breaking point. A nation on its knees needed a leader willing to do the unthinkable. In December 2012, that leader returned. Shinzo Abe wasn't just another prime minister. He was a man with a vision, a nationalist who saw Japan's economic weakness as a national shame. He came to power not with a promise, but with a weapon, a three-part strategy so radical it could only be called Abenomics. The first arrow was fiscal stimulus, more government spending. We'd seen that before. The third was structural reform, cutting red tape. Important but slow. It was the second arrow that was the declaration of war. It promised to break the Bank of Japan and force it to unleash a monetary tsunami. He appointed a new governor, Haruhiko Kuroda, a man who shared his fanatical zeal. Their goal: create 2% inflation by any means necessary. This meant one thing: they were going to print money. Not just a little. They were going to print until the yen's value buckled. Until it was so cheap that Japanese exports would become irresistible. For most people, this was just politics. For Soros and Druckenmiller, it was the starting pistol for the trade of the decade. A sovereign government was explicitly stating its intention to devalue its own currency. This wasn't a secret. It was a public broadcast. The only question was, who was listening? To understand why they were listening, you have to understand how these men think. They are not normal investors. They are apex predators. We saw this in 1992. They saw that the British pound was artificially propped up. They didn't just bet against it. They took on the Bank of England itself, borrowing billions to force a devaluation. They won. It wasn't just a trade. It was a conquest. It cemented their legend. This mindset comes from Soros's grand theory, reflexivity. It's a simple but profound idea. Most people think the market is like a thermometer measuring the underlying health of a company or an economy. Soros says the market is also the thermostat. The beliefs of the participants actively change the temperature. If everyone believes the yen will fall, they will sell it. That selling causes it to fall, which reinforces the belief, creating a feedback loop. Abenomics wasn't just a policy. It was a trigger for a global-scale reflexive event. Soros didn't need to predict the future. He just needed to understand the loop. Druckenmiller adds the killer instinct. He's famous for his philosophy of concentrated, high-conviction betting. When he sees a setup this perfect, a clear government signal, a fundamentally mispriced asset, and a market that's asleep at the wheel, he doesn't just invest. He swings for the fences. He leverages up and bets the house. For both men, the yen in 2012 was the fattest pitch they had seen in over a decade, and they were ready to hit a grand slam. So how do you build a weapon to bet against a country? You use two of the most powerful tools in finance, shorting and leverage. Shorting is simple. You borrow something you don't own, sell it, and hope the price goes down so you can buy it back cheaper. In this case, they borrowed trillions of yen. They sold them instantly for dollars. Then they waited. But they didn't just use their own money. They used leverage. For every dollar of their own capital, they might borrow 10, 20, or even 50 more. This magnifies everything. A 10% drop in the yen could mean a 100% or 200% profit. It also magnifies risk. If you're wrong, you get wiped out. But they weren't wrong. To make the trade even more elegant, they executed the second leg. They took the dollars they got from selling yen and bought Japanese stocks. They knew a weak yen would be rocket fuel for the Nikkei. It was a brilliant pincer movement. They would make money on the yen falling and make money on stocks rising. It was a trade with a built-in hedge. They started building this colossal position in late 2012. Then, in January 2013, Soros went to Davos and essentially announced his trade to the world. It was the ultimate power move. He was telling every other hedge fund on the planet, "I'm in. The water's warm. Join me." And they did. The whisper had become a roar. The result was an avalanche. The reflexive loop was now a raging inferno. The selling begot more selling. From 80 to the dollar, the yen blew past 90. It shattered the psychologically crucial 100 level in May. By the end of the year, it was trading at 105. A more than 25% collapse in a major global currency in 1 year. In the stately world of foreign exchange, this is the equivalent of a supernova. For the followers, the hedge funds who jumped on the bandwagon, it was a great year. For the Japanese importers and consumers, it was a painful shock as the price of everything from oil to iPhones went up. But for the architects, for Soros and Druckenmiller, it was the sound of inevitability. It was the beautiful, clean execution of a flawless thesis.
Get free access to our online trading course in the description and in the pinned comments. If you want to learn more about ETFs, more about the foreign exchange market, and more about basic financial literacy, then this is a must for you. Be sure to download it.
By February, Soros's fund was already up nearly $1 billion on the trade. By the end of the year, it was a key driver of his $4 billion in personal earnings. It was, without a doubt, the trade of the century. So what do we learn from this? This wasn't about a lucky guess. It was about a fundamental truth of markets and human nature. The majority is almost always wrong about major turning points. We are creatures of habit, anchored to a reality that has already passed. We fight the last war. Soros and Druckenmiller teach us that true insight comes from detaching from the noise and observing the deep undercurrents of change. They saw a government forced to choose between a strong currency and economic survival. They knew survival would win. They understood that human psychology, the reflexive loop of fear and greed, is the most powerful force in any market. They didn't predict the future. They simply opened their eyes and saw the present more clearly than anyone else. And for that, they were rewarded with billions.